I'm David Bullman. I'm an assistant professor of China Studies here at SAIS. It is my great pleasure today to introduce Professor Joel Andreas, who is at the Sociology Department at the Homewood campus at Hopkins, where he's been since 2003. His research interests include political contention and social change in contemporary China. He is the author of 2 books and numerous journal articles and chapters. His first book, The Rise of the Red Engineers, analyzed the contentious merger of new and old elite following the 1949 revolution and the Cultural Revolution through a very detailed case study of Tsinghua University. Today, we'll be discussing Professor Andreas' second book, Disenfranchised, The Rise and Fall of Industrial Citizenship in China. I will not read the whole book blurb because you can do that as well as I can, of course, but let me note that this book was the recent winner of the Joseph Levinson Book Prize by the Association for Asian Studies. According to AAS, the prize criteria is whether the book is the greatest contribution to increasing understanding of the history, culture, society, politics, or economy of China. And having just read the book, which came out last month and I got to read this week, this is a wholly deserved honor. In the book, Professor Andreas really digs deeply into factory institutions and politics and worker participation and autonomy, looking at the Mao era through to today, relying on rich interviews, really in-depth interviews with both workers and managers. For myself, as a political economist who often focuses on sort of the macro view of industrial development when thinking through things like the first 5-year plan, the Cultural Revolution, the early years of opening and reform, SOE restructuring processes, this book was extremely valuable for me in improving my understanding of actual factory dynamics, worker power, worker motivations, and reform processes. The book is really intellectually deep. It's full of interesting cases and quotes, and yet it's written in such a way that even a non-sociologist like myself can find very accessible. So I will save any other comments for after the presentation, but I highly encourage you to go and buy the book. So I can't wait to hear Professor Andreas' presentation, which will last for about 40 or 45 minutes, after which we'll open the floor to discussions. If you have any questions, please enter them in the Q&A box that you should see down there, and I will ask Professor Andreas myself. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Professor Andreas, and thank you very much for being here.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank SAIS and Andy Murtha for inviting me to be here today and talk about my book. I'd like to thank David Bullman for his very kind introduction. I'd like to thank Pedro and Madeline and Sonia for helping out and organize the program. And I'd like to thank everybody who's come to participate in this webinar. I'm eager to talk about my new book, or my recent book, and let me share. I'm going to be presenting a PowerPoint presentation, so let me share that with you. To start out. Okay. I'm looking forward to everybody's comments and questions after the talk. The book is based on 10 years of research into the evolution of industrial relations in China over the past 10 decades, really from before the revolution until the present day. First, I'd like to put the story I'm going to tell in a historical and global context. In a recent class about China, we were discussing long-term job tenure in the Chinese work unit system, which existed from the 1950s to the 1980s. And a French exchange student raised her hand and asked, but that was true not only in China, it was also true in France. And that's absolutely true. The decades after the Second World War were what I call the global era of industrial citizenship. And workers were considered legitimate stakeholders in factories. They weren't simply hired hands. They had long-term job tenure, and they were highly organized through unions and work councils in many factories. Some of these unions and work councils were more autonomous. Others were organized by management or by the state, but all of them in some way provided a venue for participation in the factory affairs. There were also, during this period, there was a slogan of industrial democracy was widespread. It was never fully realized, of course, but workers often had substantial power inside factories, especially on the shop floor. These ideas of industrial citizenship and industrial democracy originated in Europe in the early years of the 20th century, but they were later extended to the developing world, and they were extended to both capitalist and to socialist countries. Since the 1980s, they've been severely eroded with the rise of neoliberalism, which has changed industrial relations substantially. in China and around the world. My book is about a single country. It's about China. I look at the changes in industrial relations from 1949 to the present, tracing really the rise of industrial citizenship and then the fall of industrial citizenship in recent decades. And I compare two eras. First, the work unit system, that it was in existence from the 1950s through the 1980s. And then the modern enterprise system, that's what they call it. It's been in existence since the 1980s. The transition between the two has been called industrial restructuring. There's been a substantial amount of academic work, scholarship on industrial restructuring, what it's meant. Most of it is focused on the economic impact of industrial restructuring. My work really focuses on the political impact. And by that, I mean the changing power relations between workers and managers inside Chinese factories. With this book, I joined a debate among China scholars about the relationship between job tenure and employee dependency and workplace power. The terms of this debate have long been set by Andrew Waller's classic book, Communist Neo-Traditionalism, published in 1986, still during the work unit era. And in the book, he argued, he made two very strong points, that permanent employment and workplace provision of welfare led to dependency of workers on the factory and on their superiors in the factory. And that to break this dependence, you had to end this system of permanent job tenure. Other scholars have challenged Walder's account as one-sided. They've argued that among the scholars have been Qifeng Li and Elizabeth Perry and John Unger and Anita Chan and Huayin Li, among others, all in their own ways. They've argued that actually permanent job tenure gave workers substantial power inside factories and increased their influence. But most of these works only treat the work unit era briefly, mainly as background for talking about industrial restructuring. Some of them only treat the work unit era and don't talk about the subsequent era of industrial restructuring. In contrast, I focus on both eras. I actually focus on the work unit era. 6 chapters in the book are about the work unit era, but then I also contrast it with what's happened since industrial restructuring in recent decades. So my book compares the two eras. Part of what I do in the book is provide a conceptual framework for this discussion. The framework involves two factors, the first of which is workplace citizenship, which is this long-term job tenure, but not only that, it's equivalent in some ways to citizenship in a national state. Under this situation where workers are considered citizens, the enterprise becomes something of a polity, a political entity in which their workers are considered members and legitimate stakeholders. The second factor is autonomy, and by that I mean the right to express opinions and organize collectively, and also to manage your own affairs on the shop floor. The basic premise of the book is that to achieve workplace democracy really requires both of these elements, both of these factors. Neither one is a dichotomous variable. Either you have it or you don't. Rather, they're continuous variables that can go from very low to very high. If you have high levels, they're combined in different ways. If you have high levels of workplace citizenship, a high level of citizenship means that workers are considered full members. All employees are considered full members of the workplace. They have an enforceable claim to their job, and they're considered legitimate stakeholders. A low level of workplace citizenship means that workers can be hired and fired at will. A high level of autonomy in the workplace means there's substantial room for expression and collective action and self-management. And a low level of autonomy means there's little room for expression, collective action, or self-management. These can be combined in different ways. So if you have low levels of citizenship and low levels of autonomy, you end up with a condition that's been widely called market despotism, different kinds of factory regimes. And this is a very common type of factory regime. A typical example would be a high turnover electronics factory. If you have high levels of autonomy, but low levels of citizenship, that means people come and go, but in their own working conditions in the workplace, they have high levels of autonomy. A typical example might be engineers in a software firm, highly skilled, good conditions in the labor market, but don't have much stake in the company, and the company doesn't have, they don't play a big role in or influence in the country, but they somewhat manage their own affairs. High levels of citizenship, but low levels of autonomy. This is also a common condition. Gives you a situation of paternalism. A typical situation would be a company town where people live. They all live with other folks in the same enterprise. They're typically there for a long time, but the company runs everything. The workers have very little power. If you have high levels of autonomy and high levels of workplace citizenship, these are the conditions that allow workplace democracy to actually allow it to thrive. An example would be, of course, a workers' collective, where everybody that works there is a member of the collective. They have voting rights. They decide what's supposed to happen. There's very few of these. Another example that people listening to this talk might be more familiar with is many universities where tenure plays a big role, and where you have then people, at least the folks who have tenure, they have the long-term stake. They're considered legitimate stakeholders. They often plan what the curriculum is. They plan their own classes. They run their own departments in many ways. And this is all based on long-term job tenure. My research is exclusively about China, as I said. And China is a good example to look at what these different factors actually mean, because there's been such radical changes in industrial relations in both factors, both in terms of autonomy and in terms of workplace citizenship over the past 70 years. My sources were interviews with workers and cadres in over 50 factories. This is in over about 12 years of research. Also looked at documents, particularly factory gazetteers, which are like factory histories, include a lot of statistics, and other factory documents, as well as newspapers. These are official newspapers, but also during the short period of the Cultural Revolution, insurrection. These were also involved, the tabloids produced by Cultural Revolution factions. Today, I'm just going to be able to give a brief synopsis of the central narrative of the book. I'll look forward to your questions if you want to know more details. Begin this story in 1948, when the Communist Party began to take control of China's factories. The party dispatched a few peasant cadres to every factory. This was a rural party made up of rural cadre. And these were not city folks. They had typically had very little education, but they had very little experience in industry or urban society. But they had a tremendous amount of power then when we went to the factories, once the communist regime was established. They didn't trust the capitalists or the old regime managers, and they relied on workers as they took control of these factories. This was true not only in private factories, there also was a substantial number of government factories, public factories, that had been taken over from the Kuomintang. They didn't trust the officials in those factories either. So they mobilized the workers against the capitalists and the old regime managers. To do this, they built a factory party organization on the shop floor, recruited the workers they trusted most into these party organizations. And then they organized to include all the workers. They organized union organizations and staff and workers congresses. And they systematically promoted workers to leadership positions in the factories, taking the place of the old capitalists and the old managers. This took place over a decade. By 1956, they had, or nearly a decade, they had nationalized all of industry in China. During this period, they set up what was called the work unit system. And under the work unit system, as I've noted, workers became members of the work units. Their status changed from hired hands to permanent employees. They had extensive mobility within each unit, but they had little mobility among units. It was very difficult to go from one to another. These were characterized by relatively egalitarian or remarkably egalitarian distribution compared with other countries or other time periods in China. Typically, in many factories, not typically, but in many factories, the highest paid employee was a veteran worker. It was not the party secretary or the chief engineer or the top factory director. It was a veteran worker, been there longer. They typically, workers and managers, leaders lived in the same apartment blocks. They used the same health clinics. Their children went to the same schools. They used the same bike trails to go to work every day. And at the same time then, the party emphasized the slogan of democratic management. Now, democratic management, it wasn't truly democratic, but it wasn't simply a slogan either. what they meant, they really wanted workers to participate in the management of the factories. That meant mainly self-management on the shop floor. They wanted workers, and workers met every day before work, and met every day after work to discuss the work of the day and other factory affairs. And they had, of course, they had divided responsibilities among each of the workers in these small groups. All workers were organized into small groups to manage their own affairs. And they often elected the leaders of their own small groups. The other thing that it meant, they had very little influence above the shop floor, especially in a centrally planned economy where they were not very involved in economic planning. The other thing that it meant was mass supervision over factory cadres. And that was particularly important in my research. I wanted to find out what this mass supervision actually meant. What the Communist Party was concerned about was controlling its own local cadres. They were concerned about corruption, abuse of power, alienation from the workers, what they called commandism, straying from party policies in general. And they had a very strong system of control from above. This was a highly disciplined party with a very strong administrative bureaucracy, both within the party and then also within the industrial system, within the ministries and within the managerial hierarchies of different of the local municipalities as well. So they had strong control from above, but they never considered that this was enough. They thought they needed control from below as well, and to hold the managers, the factory leaders, accountable to the workers underneath them. This was called mass supervision. Now, returning to my main themes in the book, in my estimation, the work unit system featured strong workplace citizenship, but weak autonomy. It featured strong citizenship because workers did have permanent job tenure and they were considered legitimate stakeholders. It involved weak autonomy because the Communist Party tightly controlled all factory organizations. Everything was under its control. They stifled union leaders' efforts in the 1950s. There were a couple of efforts to make unions gain more autonomy from the party and make them more accountable to the workers in some ways. But they stifled those efforts throughout the leaders of the union that wanted to make the unions more autonomous from the party. They held the Staff and Workers Congress, not only the union, but the Staff and Workers Congresses under a tight rein, and they suppressed all potential opposition. So there was little room for autonomy. Now, this was a problem for the Communist Party itself, because weak autonomy really hindered mass supervision. How could workers be expected to supervise factory leaders from whom they lacked autonomy? They tried to deal with this problem. It's a fundamental problem in how they were organizing the factories through recurrent mass movements, culminating in the Cultural Revolution. I consider all of these mass movements, the ones I'm going to talk about today, as experiments in how to introduce some kind of mass supervision or some kind of autonomy into mass supervision. There were a number of campaigns. The first began shortly after the Communist Party took power, the 3 Antis campaign and the 5 Antis campaign in 1951 and 1952. But lack of autonomy became a much more pressing issue after 1956. Before 1956, during the 3 Antis and the 5 Antis campaign, these were directed against the capitalists and the old managers largely, although they were also directed against the new communist cadres that come into the factory. But they considered the main problem was corruption of these cadres by the old managers and the old capitalists. Now, after 1956, the old capitalists and managers didn't have any power anymore. Everything was under the control of the Communist Party, and this question of autonomy became much more severe. So the subsequent movements were experiments in some ways in how to introduce mass supervision into these campaigns to criticize party cadres. I look at 3 campaigns. These are the 3 biggest campaigns, the 3 most important campaigns. There were lots more. The first is the party rectification campaign in 1957. The second was the Forklings campaign in the early 60s, and the third was the Cultural Revolution in the late 60s. The party rectification campaign, this was really quite remarkable in that this was the first time that Mao really encouraged freewheeling criticism of communist cadres from below. This was a direct response to now the communist cadres controlled everything. It took place mainly among intellectuals in schools and offices. That's what everybody reads about. That's what most scholarship is about. But it also took place in factories. In fact, it took place at most of the factories that I investigated. Union leaders, this was one of the times when union leaders pressed for more autonomy for the union and for the Staff and Workers Congress. It was the high point of the Staff and Workers Congress activities. But at the same time, workers organized protests and strikes independently, spontaneously. The experiment was quickly aborted after only 6 weeks due to opposition within the party, and it gave rise to the anti-rightist campaign. This really had disastrous consequences. The people who spoke up during the party rectification campaign were then punished, and it made citizens reluctant to raise criticism for years to come. The next campaign, the next large campaign, was the Forklings campaign, also known as the Socialist Education Movement, between 1962 and 1966. It was initially carried out in villages, and actually that's what most of the scholarship once again is about, but it also took place in factories. In fact, it was only carried out in about a quarter of villages, but almost all large factories had a Forklings campaign. Virtually every one that was set up by 1964 that I investigated. The party, this was now Mao retreated from this freewheeling criticism. Instead, the party went back to a more conventional means of mass supervision. They sent in outside work teams made of party officials, and the local factory party leaders were set aside typically. The work team came in, they recruited activist workers to join the Forklings committee. Typically, they recruited ones that they didn't think were very close to the existing leadership in the factory. And then all workers were mobilized to criticize the factory leaders. And typically the campaigns closed with new factory elections where they elected small group leaders and workshop leaders, sometimes even factory directors. These were all tightly managed election campaigns, of course, or elections. Everything in this campaign was tightly controlled from above. The workers participated under work team leadership, and the whole campaign was, it kind of reinforced this type of top-down authority by party officials, even though this was now outside officials that came in to lead the campaign and organize criticism of the local officials. Looking back on the Forklings campaign, my judgment is that it was very effective in curbing corruption. I think most scholarship has agreed on this. It was much less effective in curbing cadres, quote, bureaucratic tendencies, or but this is what Mao was most concerned about, actually. These questions of isolation from the masses and commandism and controlling and restricting and repressing. The campaign was intended to address this, but it was very difficult to address it through top-down run campaign. Mao was not at all satisfied with the campaign. At the height of the campaign in January of 1965, he said, when you develop a mass movement in the midst of the struggle, masses are going to do what they want to do, and they'll create their own leaders. In short, you have to rely on the masses. You can't rely on the work teams. The work teams don't understand the situation, or in ignorance, they become bureaucrats and obstruct the movement. At this point, Mao had already developed an increasingly jaundiced view of his own party officials. This was clear at the same moment. He wrote on a report that a work team produced about a factory campaign, the Forklings campaign. He wrote in 1965, he wrote, the class of bureaucrats, he's talking about his own officials, is sharply opposed to the working class and poor and lower middle peasants. These leaders who take the capitalist road have become or are becoming capitalists who suck the workers' blood. How can they sufficiently understand the necessity of socialist revolution? They are the targets of the revolution. So by 1966, he had little confidence in the work team method, and he wanted to experiment with a much more radical method of mass supervision, and this gave rise to the Cultural Revolution. So in 1966, he fomented a rebel movement. He called on students to form rebel groups, and then later he called on workers and peasants to form rebel groups. Their main characteristics were they were autonomous from the local party organization, and they attacked local party leaders. They were autonomous from the party organization in general. Workers quickly divided in every factory into rebel and conservative camps. The rebels attacked the factory party authorities, and the conservatives defended them. In my view, the rebels were effective agents of mass supervision. This was because they were self-organized. The leaders nominated themselves and they recruited their own followers. And they reformed in every workshop. They reformed small fighting groups, and then these small fighting groups banded together to form big coalitions, particularly as the rebels fought the conservatives conservatives. Everybody was recruiting different people to become as big a group as they could, a bigger coalition as they could. So you had these two big sides fighting each other, the rebels and the conservatives. Both sides in some ways were led by workers, but certainly the rebel side was led by workers. Some of these workers were rank and file party members, but they were typically party members that were disaffected. They were not very close to the leadership. Many others were workers who had never joined the party. The rebels were not really inspired by a particular political program. What they didn't like, the reason why they banded together and became rebels, was that they did not like the party's system of tight control. And they celebrated what Mao called rebel spirit, and his slogan, "To rebel is justified." Mao also called this big democracy. They were particularly inspired by Mao's slogan of big democracy. For Mao, that meant kind of unbridled and unruly political participation outside of institutional channels. He was talking about riots and rebellions and revolutions and street protests. For him, this was big democracy. This was compared to the previous types of mass supervision. The Cultural Revolution was certainly an unbridled and unruly movement. Rebel workers that I spoke with stressed how different the Cultural Revolution was from previous mass supervision movements. A shift leader in an electronics plant said, "Before you didn't dare speak because of the cadres, but now you could speak the truth. You didn't have to be concerned about what the leaders thought. They were all capitalist workers. Their power was gone." A railroad worker told me, "When we called meetings, the leaders didn't dare talk. They were the targets. But the conservatives insisted that the party committee had not made any mistakes. It was a debate among the masses. We debated all the time, when we were working, when we ate, after work." This movement, however, was not a spontaneous movement. The rebels responded to Mao's call. They could not have existed. They couldn't have organized themselves except for Mao's call. They challenged party authority, but they strived to be loyal to Mao. That was very difficult at times, but that was their intention. They adhered to Mao's directives in general. That meant they focused on criticizing cadres. That's what they were supposed to do. But they opposed workers raising economic demands, and this became a big controversy. This photo here is of rebel workers, is the rebel workers organization, writing a big character poster condemning economism. You weren't supposed to raise economic demands. People have referred to the Cultural Revolution as a top and bottom versus the middle movement, and I think that's an appropriate conception. This was Mao at the top with the masses of workers and peasants and students, at least the rebel masses, on the bottom, versus the Communist Party officialdom in the middle. In January of 1967, Mao made a really remarkable, extraordinary decision. He called on rebels to seize power in their workplaces. From that point on, or actually before that point, the factory organization became paralyzed. It did not meet anymore for the next couple of years in many factories. And factories fell into the hands of contending factions. This became a much more complicated factional conflict, increasingly violent. I did case studies of factories in Zhengzhou and Luoyang and Wuhan in the center of China, big industrial cities. I won't go into the differences between the cities now. I'll just try to pull out some general findings, but I welcome your questions. Mao, a big point is that Mao never really intended for the rebels to take power. He intended for them to be temporary agents of mass supervision. This becomes very clear if you look at what happened in this history. Instead of having a whole new leadership in the factory, he instead called for the formation of revolutionary committees. He sent in military officers, a small group of military officers to each factory. He called, and the military officers were supposed to negotiate the formation of these new revolutionary committees, which were supposed to be composed of a number of veteran factory cadres that were selected by the workers. Now, principally, the rebel movement had to agree on these. And then mass representatives, which meant rebel leaders. This whole process of forming revolutionary committees, it was a violent process. It took several years to form them in every factory, in every province, in every city, in every province. What it ended up with was a period of military rule between 1969 and 1972. The military officers who went into the factories, they suppressed the rebel organizations. They were all commanded to put down their weapons, to stop publishing their newspapers, to stop meeting. And it marginalized, at the same time, they marginalized the veteran party cadres, and they took direct control. This was a very repressive period. Finally, the military was withdrawn in 1972, and this led to a very interesting period of factional contention inside Chinese factories. that lasted from 1973 to 1976. During this period, power was divided really into two camps once again. The veteran cadres came back and they once again had the authority in factories. They were in charge of factories. They went largely back into their old positions. But at the same time, the former rebel leaders gained positions to supervise these veteran cadres. This was typically in the union, in the propaganda units, in the factory militias, other organizations like this, where they were actually able to mobilize workers and mobilize them to criticize the veteran cadres. And so now there couldn't be formal factions, but there were informal factions in every factory. They were radical and conservative factions again. These factions extended from Zhongnanhai in Beijing all the way down to the factory floor in every factory. At the top, of course, there was the factions Zhou and Lai and Deng Xiaoping on one side and the Gang of Four on the other side. At the bottom, there were what they called the old cadres versus the new cadres. That was the typical language that was used then and is still used by my informants today. At this point, they had really distinct political programs. This was different from the rebels early in the Cultural Revolution that didn't really have a political program. Now they did. The radicals had their own program and the conservatives had their own program and their own industrial policies. This period was also characterized by alternating political winds. Mao first supported the radicals to carry out political movements and then supported the conservatives to carry out political movements to kind of rein in the radicals. So first he supported the radicals to organize the criticize Lin Biao and Confucius movement from 1973 and 1974. Then he supported, when he thought they had gone too far, he supported Deng Xiaoping's rectification campaign to bring back order in the factories and really bring the rebels into line. That was in 1975. And then when he thought Deng had gone too far, he supported the radicals again in the beat back the right deviationist wing campaign starting in late 1975, extending into 1976, which eventually toppled Deng. This was a remarkable period. During this period, they had competing mass rallies inside factories, in cities. They had big parades to central squares, both factions organizing them against each other. The most famous of these, of course, was the rally at Tiananmen Square to mourn Zhou Enlai in April of 1976. The period ended with Mao's death in September of 1976. This whole setup of these alternating political winds and these two factions depended on Mao's being on top to preside over the whole situation. The way I look at it, the Cultural Revolution was a failed experiment in autonomous mass supervision. You can divide it into two periods. The first period was the period of rebel insurrection between 1966 and 69. The rebels really were effective agents of mass supervision, I figure. They actually challenged factory party leaders and their authority, and they permanently undermined their authority. Their authority was even after 1976, they never regained the same level of authority as they had before the Cultural Revolution. They were able to do this because they were autonomous from the party organization, the rebels were. But their autonomy was severely limited by their dependence on Mao and because they were only allowed a momentary existence. This was no kind of institutionalized form of autonomous participation. The second period was institutionalized. It was this institutionalized factional contention in the last years of Mao's life. It was unprecedented within the party to have this kind of organized factional contention, but the autonomy of the factions was sharply limited. And the experiment ended then with the purge of the radical faction, which took place after Mao's death in 1976. During the early reform era, Deng Xiaoping quickly came to power. This era extended through the 1980s, long 1980s until the early 1990s. Deng's first order of business was restoring the monocratic party system, completely eliminating the factional contention by purging the radical faction. But at the same time, he enhanced formal mechanisms of worker participation. And he carried out very cautious market reforms during this period. Significantly, these market reforms left the work unit system in place. The most important elements of the work unit system was that all factories were public property and that workers had permanent job take. And so because of this, through the 1980s, workers retained substantial influence inside factories. Workers remembered this as the golden age of the Staff and Workers Congress system. The Staff and Workers Congress system had a very unstable history, which I can go into, but I won't now. It was revived. It was revived in the 1970s, in 1973, along with the union, but it didn't meet much because of this contention between radical and conservative factions. It never really became institutionalized during that period. It was revived as a definitely institutionalized form after 1978 by Deng, and it had substantial formal powers. The factory leaders were all supposed to account to the Staff and Workers Congress, which was the leading authority in the factory on paper. And it was very active during the early 1980s. It met very often. It had all kinds of committees that met very often. There were a new wave of factory elections during this period, where small group leaders and workshop directors were elected. Sometimes even factory directors were elected. But all of this took place under party tutelage. Nevertheless, the Staff and Workers Congresses became an important vehicle for workers' influence in factories. They had long meetings. They delivered particularly over welfare issues, which was never the focus of attention during the Mao era, and particularly housing. Housing became the central issue in the Staff and Workers Congress deliberation. They were severely weakened by enterprise reforms in the late 1980s. These enterprise reforms were intended to put more power in the hands of factory directors, and they began hiring in an experimental way new workers on a contract basis. The big blow came in the 1990s, and beginning with Dunk's famous Southern tour in 1992, in which he visited capitalist-invested, foreign-invested factories in Guangdong province. It was institutionalized through two important laws. One was the company law in 1994. This is the process of industrial restructuring. That set up the modern enterprise system. It privatized most factories. The vast majority of factories were privatized, small and medium-sized factories, and it restructured all enterprises. So even though the large enterprises remained in state hands, they had to, although they were open to private investment, they had to maximize profits and minimize labor costs. It replaced the three old committees with the three new committees. The old committees were the party committee, the union, and the Staff and Workers Congress. Now these were replaced by the board of directors, the board of supervisors, and the shareholders meeting. The second big piece of legislation was the labor law, enacted in 1995. When this law really reduced all work unit members, they were no longer members, they were now contract employees. And it opened the way for massive layoffs. Within a few years, 60 million workers were laid off. This gave rise to huge battles over industrial restructuring. Started in the mid-1990s. Staff and Workers Congresses became venues for these battles. The Staff and Workers Congress, by law, had to approve employee reallocation plans, which meant huge layoffs. So there was sharp conflict inside these meetings, and there was also huge protests where workers took over factories, they blocked highways, they blocked railroads. I did a case study during this period of this whole restructuring process of a company called the Brilliant Glass Company, but I won't recount the details here. This resistance continues to this day. Basically, the workers have had temporary and partial victories. They've been able to postpone restructuring in many factories. They've been able to minimize the consequences, but they certainly could not stop this whole restructuring. Tens of millions were laid off. As I've noted, 60 million just within a few years, and the layoffs went through cycles after that where many, many more have been laid off. It led to a new system of tiered employment with a shrinking core of veteran workers and that are simply waiting to retire and that are in the core positions in factories though. These are the workers that survived the layoffs, and a growing periphery of precarious workers that really are hired and fired that come and go. And most workers now belong to this category. And they're younger workers. And there's now a vast inequality. There used to be, we counted, there was pretty egalitarian economic relations or economic conditions within factories in the past, during the whole work unit era in some ways. Now there was vast inequality between the owners of factories. These are now private owners, or even in public factories, the leaders of the factories who make very high salaries, lots of perks, and workers. And there's much longer hours, much more intense labor. Many workers I spoke to work 7 days a week. long hours each day. There's also much more coercive labor relations. Small teams no longer meet, as people are still organized in small teams, but they no longer meet before work or after work, typically in most factories. And discipline is now enforced by fines and the threats of discharge. Of course, the threat of discharge did not exist in the past. The Staff and Workers Congress continues to decline. This is despite new regulations which require every factory, including every private factory, to organize a Staff and Workers Congress. In fact, most only exist on paper. Most have never met. Even where they do meet in some of these older state-owned factories, they hold irregular meetings, sometimes once every few years. They're short meetings, formalistic meetings. They have very little content to them. They're very formalistic. Or they hold no meetings at all. What's happened, the changes were captured, I think, in the comments of a couple of employees of a privatized fiberglass reinforced plastics factory. This had been part of this glass company that I mentioned I did a case study of. Now they were privatized and became an independent enterprise, a private enterprise. A veteran worker who had been there 27 years. So he lived through the whole work unit era, and now he saw the difference, compared it for me. He said, today, who dares say anything? The factory is private. If the boss wants to employ you, he'll keep you. If not, he'll get rid of you. Back then, you could raise issues. To be blunt, now they don't let you speak, they only let you work. Before, there was some room to discuss things. Since enterprise restructuring, now you just work, that's it. The deputy director of the same factory, he was also the union chair and the second largest shareholder, tells you something about the union. He expressed the same thing, but from a different perspective. He said, ordinary workers don't understand anything about the enterprise, especially the contract workers. Their brains don't think about much. They just work and get paid, that's it. Ordinary workers can't express themselves very well. They're different from us. We say things from a different perspective. We know the situation better. Clearly, they're describing the same situation from two different perspectives. So, recapping the main points of the book. The work unit system, I don't think, was ever a model of democracy in the workplace. Very few workplaces are, but the work unit system certainly was not. But workers enjoyed strong workplace citizenship. That meant during this whole era of the work unit era, they were considered legitimate stakeholders in the factory, and they actually had substantial influence, especially on the shop floor, really only on the shop floor. However, they had very weak autonomy. The union and the Staff and Workers Congress, they integrated the workers, but they operated under party tutelage, complete party tutelage for most of their history. There were experiments with autonomy in 1957 and then again in 1966, but these were quickly aborted. And without autonomy, it was impossible to really develop workplace democracy. Since this industrial restructuring, industrial citizenship has really been revoked. Workers have been reduced from work unit members to hired hands. And of course, this is, as Andrew Walter predicted, this is to diminish their dependency on the factory. Now, if they don't like one job, they go find another. They're free to do that. They no longer are dependent on the factory or on their supervisors in many ways, but it's severely eroded workers' power inside the factory. They have very, very little power inside the factory today. It's hard to tell what's going to happen in the future. There's been, of course, as everybody knows, large numbers of strikes and protests in China. These are all organized spontaneously. There can't be any kind of institutionalized unions or opposition unions or autonomous unions in any way. It's led to sharply increased wages and some concessions on the part of the party and on top of factory ownership and management. But workers will be in a weak position to demand more say inside factory or over factory affairs unless they regain some degree of job security. So that's my presentation. Those are the main points of the book. I look forward to your comments and questions. And I will stop sharing so that you can ask those questions. And I'll turn the floor back over to David.
Great, thank you so much, Professor Andreas. That was an excellent presentation, and looking forward to the Q&A. Again, if you have questions, please enter them, and I will read them out loud. I guess I will take advantage of my role as moderator to ask the first question, and it's where you ended up, and it's probably an unfair question, but of course I want to get to implications and what's going on in the Xi era and whether we see changes now in terms of enfranchisement or the dimensions you talk about in terms of worker autonomy and citizenship. So in the book itself, of course, you talk, there's unfair because you talk much more about the work unit system. You also talk briefly, of course, about the labor contract law in 2008, I guess it came out, and how that briefly led to more formal labor, although that trend backed off after a couple of years after this blip. So in thinking about the Xi era and maybe implications of two major changes that are ongoing. One is the increase in socialist rhetoric and what this means, and the other is the growing strength of the party itself. So, on the first, obviously Xi has talked about how socialism with Chinese characteristics is socialism. It's not another ism. There's talk of a new type of national system. There's a 19th Party Congress identifying a new principal contradiction about inadequate development and people's need for a better life. So more focus on equity. The two sessions itself a couple weeks ago talked about the 14th five-year plan as the first 5 years that China will look at a modern socialist, building a modern socialist country. And I think I, for one, and maybe most others, are not really sure what this means yet, but I do believe that there's more than just rhetoric to the discussion of an increased focus on equity. And the other, I guess, change that I see, of course, is the growing strength of the party. Now, you talked in your own presentation, and in the book about the shift with the company law and the labor law in the mid-1990s, to the power moving away from party committees and moving towards factory directors. In the last couple of years, there's been a lot of talk about people that follow the Chinese economy about the growing role of party committees. This is in both private enterprises and foreign enterprises who have had to actually seem to give more voice to these committees, but especially even in SOE reform where party committees are seen to be given a larger voice. So I wonder on both of these, whether you see implications for a changing role of worker citizenship, worker autonomy, or are these not enough to change the trends that you identify?
Okay, great question. And I think there are real changes taking place on this sheet. I think in the most visible are the most concerned, the folks who support the workers' movement in China, is there's a lot more repression of the workers' movement. There's a lot more repression, strikes and protests, people being jailed and arrested and threatened and called in to have tea with the police, etc., to intimidate them. But it's very real that there's changes being made in factory management and the relationship between factories, between the party and factory leaders. And part of that is between the party and private capitalists. And part of that is this insistence there has to be party committees in every factory. And that the party committees have to have some real leadership role. And so this is a kind of re-grabbing power by the party that they had been losing. Institutionally, organizationally. I think that's very true. This is part of Xi's real agenda. And at the same time, I don't think it means more power for workers at all. The party is responsible in the union that it controls for kind of mediating affairs, or mediating relations between the owners of factories and workers. That's part of its role. It's supposed to play that political role. But it doesn't mean turning over any real power to workers. The party is a very different organization today than it was during the Mao era. During the Mao era, most party members were on the shop floor. They were regular workers. Now there's very few party members on the shop floor. The party is completely a management institution. And so strengthening the party committee means nothing to workers. There's no workers in the party in general in factories. And the union is a very remote organization for them at this point. The workers are very unorganized in general, and they're not going to be organized. The party is not organizing, really, certainly not in the same way that they did in the past. They have no intention to. They don't want them to be organized. So this is a changing relationship between capitalists and the party, I think, between politics and economics, but it's not a changing relationship between workers and managers.
Great, thank you very much. So I will start reading some of the questions we've received now. I have not done a great job as moderator in reading all these questions first, but so I'm going to mostly go in order. But the first question is from Professor Murtha, who writes, Joel, fantastic work and presentation, really forces us to rethink some key parts of the Mao era. Can I ask you to tease out the relationship between the 1957 factory rectification movement and the 100 Flowers?
Okay. They were the same thing. I call it the party rectification movement because it gives it more of this. That's what it was called formally. They also used the slogan 100 Flowers. And they were the same period of time, the same events. The party rectification movement more points the direction that was to oppose to this kind of bureaucratism among party officials. That's what this party rectification movement meant. And so I use that term, but basically it was the same thing. And it only lasted, there was a long build up to it because Maos started talking about it in 1956 and it actually happened in the spring of 1957. But when it actually got going, and it got going much more slowly among workers in factories, it didn't last very long at all. It lasted about 6 weeks, and then it was crushed. And thank you, Andy, for inviting me to this forum. Appreciate it.
So maybe sticking with 1957 then, you have a question from Tim Pringle, who asks, hi, Joel. Thanks for this presentation.
All the way from London.
All the way from London. Thanks for this presentation and look forward to reading the book. Can you tell us a little more about the union folks striving for more autonomy from the union, for the union in 1957? Were the arguments similar to those developed by Li San in the early 50s, or was something else going on by the end of the first 5-year plan?
Yeah, it was very similar to Li San. The unions were not as institutionally organized in Li San's time. That was immediately after the early period when the Communist Party was just taking over factories. And it was really trying to establish what should be the role, now that we have real unions in factories that are not just insurrectionary kind of organizations for the party to mobilize workers to take over the factory and take over the country. Now that they're really organized, all workers belong to them all over the country. What relationship should it have? Li San, of course, was thrown out of leadership of the union because he raised these demands for autonomy. Later, he was replaced by Lai Ruyu, who was much more a party man in some ways, but he was much more. He supported that the union would act under the leadership of the party, and he was put in for that position. But by 1957. By 1956-57, he had really become a convert to unions should have more autonomy. They should follow, first of all, his leadership, his line of leadership from the top of the union down into the individual factories, but also they should have independence from the factory committee, the factory party committee, and the management of the factory, and they should do something. This was during 1956, 1957, when workers were really encouraged to raise their voices. And he says the union should play a role, and they should exercise these voices. And in the union newspaper, they did. They criticized lots of things about the factory conditions, factory management, etc. They were eager to play this role, and they wanted some autonomy from the factory party committee. And at every level, then the union wanted more autonomy so it could be able to represent the workers in some way, in some fashion. And that was what they were supposed to do at that point. But then with the anti-rightist movement, Lai Ruyu still remained in the union leadership, still remained at the initial part. He died of cancer very, very soon after the anti-rightist movement began, and then became a purge. He basically protected the union until he died. And then there was a widespread purge of the union of all of these more active officials that wanted the workers to have more autonomy, or the union branches to have more autonomy. And that was very much part of the anti-rightist movement at that point. And after that, the union really did not have much autonomy from the party. During the early 60s, in the Cultural Revolution, one of the first things that was done was that the rebels overthrew the union as part of management. The union really was part of management. And the rebels overthrew the union. They were encouraged to do so by Mao, along with all the rest of management in the factories. The union didn't really exist. In fact, lots of times they called it the workers, they called it a union in some ways. The rebels created this workers organization. There was also the Staff and Workers Congress was the replacement, because the Staff and Workers Congress was very much was part of the union, part of the union apparatus. They replaced that with workers congresses that were run by the rebels now. And they had some power in some factories, as long as the rebels had power. Then the union and the workers congresses, Staff and Workers Congresses, as formal institutions, were reinstated in 1973. At that point, everything was about this factional struggle between the rebels and the radicals and the conservatives. Once the radicals were thrown out, the union became once again just part of management. So that's the history of union. It hasn't changed since that time. Although there is a constant conflict in the union about they're in charge, some ways, of mediating conflicts between the management and the workers. And some of the officials take this responsibility seriously. Whenever there's a strike, they're called in to mediate. Some of them see it as their responsibility to represent more of the workers' demands, to see that the management of the factories make some concessions. And then in this whole creation of this new labor contract law in 2007, 2008, the union played a big role in pushing the elements of it that favored workers, particularly some kind of having more, at least a pathway to some kind of more permanent place in the factory. The union pushed that. And they won a lot of concessions in that law, which really haven't been put into place because the management has found all kinds of ways around them.
Great, thank you. So there are a lot more questions than we're going to be able to get to with only 5 minutes left. So hopefully we can have time for 2 more questions. I'm going to join 2 of these questions together that both have to do with methodology. First-year PhD student John Bolton asks, given the social upheaval in China since the 1950s, can you describe your research methodology and how you found individual sources for interviews? And Thomas Gold asks about whether you could talk about your fieldwork and how you gained entry to factories where most worker interviews conducted through arrangements with authorities or offsite.
Okay. You know, my first book was based on, it's a history of Tsinghua University, and I went and lived at the university, and most of the people who worked there had been students there, and they'd been there since the 1950s. A lot of them, the older folks, were retired there. And it was, I had pretty much free reign. I could talk to anybody I wanted to, they were all there. I expected to do the same thing in a factory when I started this book or this research project, and found it was impossible. Factories were just not as open places as the universities were. I worked basically outside of factories and just with any kind of contacts I could get. I never went through, or very seldom went through official channels to try to get interviews. I got interviews through contacts. A lot of them were through old rebels, who many of them had been in prison for many years, for a decade or more after Mao died. And they were now out, they were reorganizing in some ways. They were this leftist Maoist movement in China, and they had lots of contacts among the workers of their generation, and also among younger workers. They were organizing workers themselves. And so that was one way I got into factories, and then they would introduce me to conservatives as well. I would ask them to, so that I would get this whole range of people to talk to from that era. Other people, I went through my students, many of whom came from industrial families and could introduce me to folks in the factory, their parents could, and learned a lot from them. So it was all informal outside factories. I very seldom went into factories. Once in a while I had a tour of a factory or something, but never really went into factories much.
Thanks so much. So we have 2 minutes left. I probably shouldn't even ask another question, but my colleague Ling Chen has a question, which I'm going to try to sneak in very quickly, and then we'll close in a few minutes if you can answer quickly. So she asks, she says, it's a fascinating book. You mentioned workers as stakeholders during the major period of your study, but since SOEs didn't introduce shareholding systems until much later, and workers' jobs were completely safe, why would they care about enterprise affairs? Were they simply following the mobilization of various top-down campaigns?
All workers will care about factory affairs if they have an opportunity to care, unless they're just hired hands, unless they don't consider they have any stake in the factory at all, and tomorrow they could be gone and they're looking for another job all the time. They don't care much about their conditions. Anyone who works any place for a lengthy period of time, they very much care about conditions, and they try to have some control over them. And that's whether there's a formal system of having some kind of role in factory affairs or not. They're going to try to have some kind of influence in the affairs of their own workplace, where they spend 8 or 10 hours a day. They're going to want to have some control there, as much as they can possibly get. So if there's any institutional forum for them to do that, especially probably a minority, but a minority of activist workers who really want to change things, they're going to take it. And I think they definitely did during Mao era in China, and since then as well. But as workers become more just temporary and hired hands and come and go, then they have less of a stake in the factory, and they, of course, care less as well. Although they'll go on strike to protest against immediate conditions and try to improve their wages. Largely, it becomes economic conditions because they're looking just to get as much pay as they can. Don't expect to be there for very long.
All right, thank you very much. So we're at 1 o'clock. I feel terrible for the 6 or 7 questions that are still left that are excellent and that I have not asked. My apologies, but I'm told not to run us over. Professor Andreas, thank you so much. This was an excellent presentation. It's really an excellent book. I encourage everyone to go out and buy this, and I hope we can have you back at SAIS sometime soon. And
Hey,
no one else
thank
can
you,
clap,
David,
but I
and
will
thank
clap.
to everybody for participating now. I was very happy to be here.
Thanks.